10%. Not 9, not 11. Exactly 10. This number crossed through Sumer, Egypt, Babylon, the Roman Empire, medieval Europe, and arrived intact today. Present in evangelical churches across the United States, in synagogues in New York, in Buddhist temples in Japan, and in the giving practices of people who have never set foot inside any house of worship in their lives. Why this specific number? Where did it come from? And what does it really mean when someone hands it over? Most people think they know the answer, and most people are, at least in part, wrong, because the origin of the tithe is far older than the Bible. The tension around it is far more honest than either side of the debate tends to admit, and what it reveals about the relationship between spirituality and money is far more uncomfortable than any sermon or any critique usually dares to touch. Let's start at the beginning. And the beginning is not where most people expect. The first thing that surprises anyone who goes deep on this subject is discovering that the tithe did not begin with the Bible. It began much earlier. Sumerian documents, more than 4,000 years old, already record mandatory deliveries of 1/10 of the harvest to temples administered by priests who, at the time, also functioned as administrators of the state. In Babylon, the practice was equally documented. Control lists carved into clay recorded with precision what each producer delivered, what was received, what was stored. In Egypt, ancient papyri confirmed systems of taxation based on fixed fractions of production, handed over two structures of religious and political power simultaneously. Even in ancient Greece and Rome, tributes of 1/10 were common as a form of honoring specific temples, especially after military victories. In other words, before any prophet, before any sacred law, before any promise made under a star or on a mountaintop, someone had already discovered that 10% was a mathematically efficient fraction for extracting wealth from a population without destroying its capacity to keep producing. It was, before anything else, a practical solution to a problem of power. And then that solution encountered spirituality, and everything changed in meaning. The first mention of the tithe in the biblical tradition doesn't appear in a law. It appears in a scene of war. Abraham has just won an armed confrontation against a coalition of 4 kings who had captured his nephew, Lot, and sacked entire cities in the region. On the way back, victorious, carrying considerable spoils, he encounters a figure named Melchizedek. That name is strange even within the biblical tradition. King of Salem, which would become Jerusalem. Priest of the Most High God, with no father or mother recorded in the texts, no beginning or end of life mentioned, appearing from nowhere and disappearing the same way, with no verse explaining who he is or where he came from. Centuries later, the Book of Psalms would cite him as the model of an eternal priesthood, and the New Testament letter to the Hebrews would return to this mysterious figure to explain something about the nature of Jesus himself: one name, one scene, and a presence. The tradition never stopped trying to understand. He brings bread and wine to Abraham, blesses the victorious man, and Abraham, spontaneously, with no law requiring it, no prophet asking for it, no expectation built around it, gives him 1/10 of everything he had taken. Nobody told him to. Nobody billed him. It was a choice. That detail matters more than it seems. Because at that moment, the tithe was not yet obligation, it was recognition. It was a form Abraham found to say, "This victory didn't come from me alone." Generations later, his grandson Jacob is fleeing home after deceiving his own brother and his own father, carrying the weight of a family betrayal, alone in a desert between 2 cities. Not knowing if he'll survive the next day and unsure if he deserves to, he sleeps on the ground with a stone as his pillow at the most vulnerable point of his entire life. And that night, he has one of the most intense visions in all of biblical tradition. A stairway touching heaven, angels going up and down it, and a voice that promises companionship, protection, and a land that will have no end. When he wakes up, still shaking, still processing what he experienced, he does something curious for a man who just had a vision of greatness. He makes a small promise, proportional to what he has, which is almost nothing. If God goes with me, If I have food and clothes, if I return in peace to my Father's house, then God will be my God, and of everything He gives me, I will give back a tenth. It's an asymmetric contract. A man who has nothing offers a fraction of something that doesn't yet exist to a force he has barely started to believe in. Notice, in both stories, Abraham and Jacob, the tithe comes before any law. It's not the fulfillment of a rule. It's a gesture of a relationship. It's the recognition that nothing one has came entirely from oneself. And in both cases, it's born not in prosperity, but at the limit. One man returning from war and another running away with nothing. The offering didn't wait for abundance. It arose where there was more reason to hold on than to let go, and only much later, centuries later, within the context of Moses and the construction of a people with laws and structure, does the tithe take legal shape. And here enters a detail that most people who have ever heard of the tithe don't know at all. There were at least 3 different types of tithe in Mosaic law, and they didn't all go to the same place, and they didn't all serve the same purpose. The first was intended for the Levites, the tribe that received no land as an inheritance when the people entered the Promised Land, who lived dedicated to the service of the temple, and needed to be sustained by the work of everyone else. In practical terms, it was the salary of those who served the community spiritually, with no land to farm and no trade to run. Each Levite, in turn, gave a tenth of what they received to the priesthood. A chain of redistribution. The second tithe was different from anything one imagines when hearing the word tithe. It was used by the very families who generated it to celebrate communal festivals in Jerusalem. The people brought their offering and consumed it before God in collective celebration, sharing it with their children, servants, and local Levites. In that case, the tithe didn't feed the priesthood. It fed the joy of an entire people celebrating together. It was almost the opposite of what is understood today. And the third, collected every 3 years and kept inside the towns themselves, was entirely devoted to the poor, to widows, to orphans, and to foreigners within the borders of Israel. It went to no temple. It remained locally available for whoever was in need. 3 distinct purposes: the sustaining of spiritual service, collective celebration, and care for those who have nothing. The tithe, at the origin of Hebrew law, was less a transfer of resources to a temple and more an integrated system of social solidarity, with sacred language behind it. Centuries pass. The tradition goes through exiles, reconstruction, contact with Greek thought and with Roman power. And the moment arrives when Jesus appears within a context where the tithe was fully established as religious practice, and where some were taking that observance to extremes that, for him, revealed a dangerous confusion about what really mattered. In one of the most direct moments of the Gospels, he looks at Pharisees who tithe down to aromatic herbs, down to the smallest grain picked from the garden, herbs like mint and cumin that barely justify the effort of counting, and says, "You give a tenth of all of this, but you neglect the more important matters of the law, which are justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These should be done without leaving the others undone." Notice the complexity of what he's saying. He isn't criticizing the tithe. He's criticizing the inversion of priorities, the formal fulfillment, while the essential is ignored. But he also doesn't release anyone from doing it by saying it should be done without leaving the other things undone. He didn't abolish the tithe, but he made clear that a tenth delivered with mathematical precision, while the poor at the door were ignored or the neighbor was wronged in business, was empty perfection. The practice without the heart that originated it was not faithfulness. It was accounting disguised as spirituality, and maybe that's exactly the distinction that continues to be the central battleground in any honest conversation about the tithe today. And here begins a tension that crosses centuries and arrives alive and intense into the present day. In the early centuries of Christianity, the tithe was voluntary. The earliest Christian texts speak of proportional generosity, of giving according to what one has, with no obligation of a fixed percentage. Paul, writing to the Corinthians, doesn't cite a number. He cites an attitude. Each one should give what they have decided in their heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, because God loves a cheerful giver. The Tithing, one of the oldest Christian texts in existence, from the late 1st century, speaks of offering the first fruit, the first portions of what one produces, but without specifying an exact fraction, leaving the proportion as a personal decision. The central idea was that each person contribute what they could with joy and not under compulsion. But over time, as the church grew and needed to organize itself, support temples, clergy, and social works, the practice was gradually formalized. In councils from the 6th century onward, the idea begins to appear that the tithe would be a moral obligation, and in the 8th and 9th centuries, in parts of Europe, it was incorporated into civil law, in certain territories with legal penalties for those who didn't pay. The gesture that was born as spontaneous recognition, as an intimate contract between a man and a promise, had become, in some structures, a levy administered by the state. That, more than anything else, is what feeds modern skepticism, and it is in many cases legitimate skepticism. When an institution holding power charges an offering that, at its origin, was free, and when non-payment generates public pressure, social shame, or exclusion from membership, something fundamental has changed in the nature of the gesture. The declaration became a debt. Freedom became conformity. And when pastors who preach prosperity as the reward for tithing are found living in luxury, incompatible with any honest reading of the biblical text, the trust that made the gesture possible breaks in a way that no theological argument can rebuild on its own. And that's exactly why the contemporary Christian world is now in one of the most active debates on this topic. Evangelical churches that teach the tithe as a direct spiritual obligation, arguing that the principles of the Old Testament were not abolished, and that Malachi, when Ed writes, "Can a person rob God? Yet you are robbing me in your tithes and offerings," is speaking directly to Christians today. Other churches that respond that Malachi was written before Christ, within a specific theological context that the New Testament transformed, and that applying that passage to Christians today is a reading that ignores the context. Others still that teach that, in the New Testament, the reference is not a percentage, but an attitude, giving with joy, according to each person's own decision in their heart, without compulsion. There are those that refuse to talk about percentages at all, and simply challenge their members to ask, what are you giving up to contribute to something bigger than yourself? And there are those that prefer not to talk about money from the pulpit at all, seeing it as an entirely private decision between the believer and their own conscience. And here is, perhaps, the real spiritual core of all of this. Not the number, the gesture the number represents. There's a scene in the Gospels that almost never appears in discussions about the tithe, even though it may be the most radical of all. Jesus is sitting across from the temple treasury, watching who deposits what. Wealthy people keep coming and putting in large sums. Then a widow arrives, and she deposits 2 coins, the smallest denomination in circulation at the time. And Jesus calls the disciples over and says, "This widow has put in more than all the others combined, because they all gave out of their surplus, but she gave out of what she needed to live." No percentage mentioned, no table, no calculation, just the observation that there is a fundamental difference between giving what's left over and giving what costs something. And that, in the framework Jesus presents, the spiritual value of an offering is not measured by what arrives in the treasury, but by what is left missing in the one who gave. When Abraham handed 1/10 of the spoils to Melchizedek, the value wasn't in the objects delivered. It was in the recognition that the victory had a source beyond himself. When Jacob, with nothing, promised 1/10 of nothing that didn't yet exist, the value wasn't in the arithmetic. It was in the vulnerability of a man finally stopping his dependence on himself alone. And when the widow deposited 2 coins, the value wasn't in the amount. It was in the wholeness of the gesture. And that's where the spiritual tradition, in all its forms, seems to converge on an idea deeper than any percentage. An offering, any true offering, has more to do with what happens inside the one who gives than with what reaches the hands of whoever receives it. It's not a transaction. It's a declaration that life is not closed in on itself, that there is something beyond the self that deserves to participate in what the self accumulates, And that declaration, repeated over time, ends up shaping the person who makes it far more than any theology can describe in words. And maybe that's why the offering, in any tradition, has always been treated as a mirror. What you give, how you decide that, with what emotion you hand it over, at what point in the month you remember it, whether you remember it with gratitude or with resistance. All of that reveals where you really place your trust. If prosperity is your final security, letting go of part of it will hurt in a specific way. If you trust in something beyond your own capacity to accumulate, that same gesture will have a completely different quality. The percentage may be the same, the interior, never. In many traditions today, this idea survives without a fixed number. In Buddhism, the practice of dana, unconditional generosity, is considered one of the foundations of the spiritual path, with no percentage, no table, no collector. The idea is that generosity, especially when it expects nothing in return, weakens attachment to the self and to the things the self has accumulated. And attachment is, in that tradition, the root of nearly all suffering. Giving, in that context, is not an act for the other. It is an act of liberation for oneself, a spiritual practice disguised as an economic gesture. In Islam, beyond the zakot, the mandatory social tax of 2.5% of accumulated wealth destined for the poor, there is sadaqah, voluntary charity that can be any amount, at any time, motivated only by the inner disposition to open the hand. According to Islamic tradition, any sincere smile toward another human being is sadaqah. Any gentle word, any act that relieves the suffering of a living being. The percentage, when it exists, is a floor, not a ceiling. And whatever goes beyond it is counted as generosity no bank can record. In Jewish communities, the concept of tzedakah, which literally means not charity, but justice, is lived as an ethical obligation, not as generous option. Giving is not a favor that those who have do for those who don't. It is an obligation of those who have received toward those who have not yet. The percentage may vary, but the obligation doesn't. And in the completely secular world, far from any temple, the idea of 10% has returned with surprising force in recent years. There is a movement called Giving What We Can, founded by philosophers at Oxford concerned with practical ethics, in which people of any belief, or none, formally commit 10% of their income to causes that are demonstrably effective, calculated to save the most lives or reduce the most suffering per dollar spent. No God, no priest, no religious law. Just a decision that part of what one earns belongs, by principle, to a world larger than one's own life. In just a few years, that movement mobilized billions of dollars in pledges from ordinary people. The number came back, without the religious packaging, but with the same logic that was there before the Bible existed. Nobody produces in a vacuum. Nobody exists alone. And a fraction of what one receives, given back to the larger flow it came from, is perhaps the most honest way of acknowledging that. But that raises a question that goes far beyond theology, and that applies to anyone who has ever thought about it, regardless of belief. Does what you do with 10% change who you are with the remaining 90? Because maybe the deepest function of the offering was never to sustain an institution, pay a pastor's salary, or fund a building project. Maybe it's something much simpler and far more radical than that. It's the gesture of practicing, in a repeated and concrete way, the idea that you are not the center of everything, that there is something that deserves to receive a share of what you worked to have, and that opening your hand regularly, deliberately, even when it costs something, reorganizes from within the relationship between who you are and what you have. Not because God needs your 10%, but because you might need the discipline of letting go of it. And maybe it's no coincidence that 10% specifically has held up for so long and in so many places. 9% doesn't carry the same symbolic weight. 11% feels excessive to sustain as a habit. 20% scares people before they even begin. But 10 has something round about it, something complete, easy enough to calculate without any mental effort at all. It's the number that hurts enough to mean something, but that the body can actually tolerate. The exact range between what represents a real sacrifice and what is still reasonably sustainable. A number old enough to have outlasted the fall of entire civilizations, and that alone should be a reason to take it seriously. And this is where I'd like to hear from you. Do you tithe? How often? Where does it go? Have you given in the past and stopped? And what made you stop? Have you never given and never will? And exactly why? Or do you give in a different way, at a different percentage, to a different destination, without calling it a tithe, but with the same intention behind it? Because this might be the most honest conversation a spiritual community can have. Not whether you pay or don't pay, but what you believe happens inside you when you open your hand, or when you deliberately decide not to. What you think that gesture reveals about where you actually place your trust. If you think the tithe is financial manipulation dressed up as spirituality, say that too. This is a conversation that needs every perspective. Write in the comments what you think. What percentage, what criteria do you use to choose where it goes? Your answer matters. Not because it will change the history of the tithe, but because it might clarify something in your own. If you stayed all the way here, it's because this question touches you in some way. And maybe that's exactly what the tithe has always been trying to say, before it even had a name. That some questions only make sense when you stop avoiding them. 10%, not 9, not 11. Exactly 10, a number that crossed civilizations, traditions, and millennia, and arrived at you here today. What you do with it is the only part of this story that hasn't been written yet.